I'm Rusmir Mahmutćehajić, and I have opened this first panel and moderate Inaugural Lectures. In this 18th conference of Unity and Plurality in Europe, we in International for Bosnia have been trying to continue with long-term oriented project. As well, Bosnia and the Bosnian society, through more than 1,000 years, were always plural society. In the earlier period, it was society with different Christologies, ecclesiologies, and always we were exposed to tendencies from neighborhood to impose homogenization, Christological, ecclesiological, and political in this time. And the paradigms of this plurality have been changing. From 19th century, it got basic contents we can now see even survive as ethno-nationalism, as religious fundamentalism, and different form of hybridization of this exclusive ideologies. We, during the war and after the war, we are trying to articulate an answer on this in the time of transition from totalitarian communist system, in which this problem were excluded on the basis of political pragmatism. We had to tolerate, it was position, this difference as long as they are present in expectation that they will vanish, that they will disappear. Some people in this period were treating this plurality on the basis of indifference, and they were expressing their view onto Bosnian religious plurality on the basis, it is not important. We are indifferent who is who. Let's live publicly together, but public space was also totalitarian. Any kind of presenting individual and collective identity outside of this presentation of ideological homogenization were considered as irritation, unacceptable way of life, and so on. Then, this liberal premises that human rights, individual rights are uncontestable. We have to accept autonomy of individual is for this region in some way, modern presentation, still new and rarely understood solution for the plural society. We, International Forum Bosnia, were trying to understand all these forms, political pragmatism, indifference, and autonomous self, and so on, and to see is there a possibility that in our religious tradition, in the revival of religious intellectualities, connected with Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, and so on, to see is there a possibility to grant tolerance in these principles of this tradition. Let's say in immanence of the one, absolute immanence, absolute absolute incomparability to one, and so on. And to see, is there a possibility that in sources of different traditions. We see the reasons to care about plurality, to develop harmonious society, not, let's say, pressing, not excluding that what we are. And this trying, this experiment was in the basis of our idea to establish International Bosnia and to see that private and public space have been belonging to everybody. That all form of difference is acceptable as long as it is not against difference. This Mostar conference was a part of that. And you know, we were developing these ideas through this conference, depending on our real possibilities, real sources, and so on. Sometime on this conference we had almost 100 people from different sides of the world. Some of the greatest world intellectuals were participating in this. And let's say, maybe 10 years ago we decided that this working part of the conference will be devoted to selected intellectuals who were researching, writing, presenting, advocating the key ideas of the contemporary world, in which we are faced with many old and many new problems, unresolved questions, and so on. This time we decided, let's say, to ask two intellectuals, Kealy, Loughlin Kealy, and Amra Hadžimuhamedović. We selected them on the basis of their writings, interest, just in the field we are wrestling for in Bosnia. The first presentation in these two inaugural lectures, in which we are expressing acknowledgement for these two personalities, and from the titles and presentation you will see clearly reasons why we decided in this time. So, Amra Hadžimuhamedović is a very important contributors, contributors in all our activities, and we could say one of the founding members of this project throughout this period. She was included in everything that was connected with striving to survive in Bosnia, to protect Bosnia, to present Bosnia, and so on. Today she is, in our view, with our respect, but one of the most active in presentation, what we are inheriting as sources for future. So, we will start with Kealy. This is 25 minutes. Kealy could not join us due to some health problems, but he will be presented through a recorded lecture after that. Thank you so much.
Good morning. I am honored to have been invited to contribute to this international conference on unity and plurality. I thank the organizers for the invitation and wish I could be with you in person. We live in a digitized world where the destruction of cultural heritage in times of conflict is seen everywhere, almost as it occurs. What was built across centuries may be destroyed in moments, but the effects of destruction, physical, psychological, and social, linger for an indefinite time. The international heritage bodies, UNESCO, the World Heritage Centre, the World Bank, and organizations such as ICRAM and ICUPE and others, have worked to unravel the consequences for cultural heritage, its protection, its redemption, reconstruction, its future, and the related consequences for the future of societies impacted by traumatic events. I want to tell you a story. Like a lot of stories, it is not easy to say exactly when it began, and still harder to say how it will end. But perhaps it reflects on some of the issues that underlie the theme of this conference. The story is from my own country, Ireland. Ireland is in existence as an independent state since 1922. It is a country that, following a traumatic birth, has to a great extent, and to all appearances, experienced political stability for 100 years, but whose history, mythology, and folk memory are shaped by conflict, political, religious, and social. The examples of monuments that I show related to that time are not chosen because they're in some way unique. They are chosen because they are not. The story is in two parts: a decade of centenaries and interpretations and forecasts. The core of the story is the connection between memory and commemoration and the construction of the future. As a beginning, we can start with the decision by the Irish state to launch a decade of centenaries as a way of marking the 100th anniversary of its foundation. That decision arose out of the complexities of dealing with continuing political and religious tensions in Northern Ireland and the promotion of peace between people from different traditions. Rather than use a single date, the commemoration meant that over a period of 10 years, the state and its institutions marked the passage of 100 years from an equivalent period of time that was critical to the foundation of the society and body politic of today. That period, from 1912 to 1923, was one of political and social transformation. The state commemorations have generated creative, scholarly, and social initiatives and brought to light many things that had passed out of memory and out of discourse. Along with the many significant political and cultural events during that period 100 years ago, there were intense armed conflicts which resonated throughout the island of Ireland for generations to follow. There was the contested engagement of Irish soldiers in World War I within the British Army, an unsuccessful rebellion against British rule in Ireland in 1916, followed by a war of independence against Britain that ended in 1921 with a treaty that resulted in the partition of the island, with part gaining a measure of independence and part remaining within the United Kingdom. That partition gave rise to a civil war between supporters and opponents of the treaty, a short-lived but intensive struggle between former comrades that witnessed the deaths of many of the key actors before it ended in May 1923. The two political entities established on the island under the terms of the treaty were each characterized by a dominant religious and political affiliation, with sectarian tensions between Christian traditions being especially marked in that section that remained part of the United Kingdom. The motivation of the Irish state in establishing this decade of centenaries was that the commemoration of different dimensions of that historic period could support ongoing efforts towards reconciliation and constructive relationships, renewed efforts that could heal differences between religious and political traditions across Ireland and between Ireland and the United Kingdom. This part of the story will sketch out some of the elements involved as they relate to the theme of today's conference. In reflecting on the use of heritage in commemoration, we are reminded of Alice Regal's definition. A monument, in its oldest and most original sense, is a human creation, erected for a specific purpose of keeping single human deeds or events alive in the minds of future generations. Regal spoke of monuments that were intentional and those that were unintentional, a point later elaborated in the first article of the Venice Charter, when it spoke of buildings that had become monuments with the passage of time. That idea, whatever its historic context, seems to presume a form of consensus, a consensus which today has become elusive. We can keep that idea in mind as we look at some monuments impacted by the armed conflicts commemorated in the decade of centenaries and their aftermaths. The new Irish Free State restored and reconstructed the great classical buildings of Dublin city centre that had been destroyed between 1916 and 1923. The rebellion of 1916 resulted in the destruction of a substantial section of the city centre of Dublin. Much of the great expanse of O'Connell Street, the principal street of the city, was destroyed. The buildings destroyed included the General Post Office, dating from 1814, which was the headquarters of the rebels. That building was reconstructed in 1929, resumed its use, and later also hosted the national radio station. The Custom House, built in 1791, was burnt in the War of Independence and rebuilt by the state in 1928, following the treaty that ended that armed conflict. The stone used in the original building was Portland stone, imported from Britain. In a fusion of economy and nationalism, an Irish limestone was used in the restoration instead, to rebuild the drum for the dome. The building now houses a government department. The Four Courts building, so called because it houses Dublin District Court, High Court, Court of Appeal and Supreme Court, was built between 1776 and 1802. Its destruction marked the outbreak of the Civil War in 1921, when it was occupied by the anti-treaty side. It was destroyed by forces of the new state, using artillery provided by the British Army. It was reconstructed in 1932 and resumed its function. One could argue that the decisions to restore and reuse these monumental buildings, taken in the years immediately following conflict, is consistent with the idea that monuments can support broader ideals of reconciliation. There is evidence that the decisions at the time reflected the awareness that the restored buildings represented the value of continuity, and that the restorations might reassure elements within society that still looked to Britain as underpinning their sense of identity. From that perspective, one can say that the decision created monuments with a new layer of symbolism. The impoverished circumstances of the new state meant that the ideals did not come cheaply. But using these examples of official initiative provides a simplified narrative that surfs over complex realities as they were at the time and as they later unfolded. Subsequent years showed the official protection of monuments did not reflect such vision and inclusiveness. For most of the 20th century, a somewhat schizophrenic situation prevailed, in which the prehistoric monuments and the great pre-colonial ecclesiastical and secular monuments were maintained as ruins by the state, their place in the physical and mental landscapes intact, while other architectural heritage was inadequately protected and its conservation underfunded. Many buildings of 18th and 19th centuries were stigmatized as colonial remnants of the British Empire, and as late as the 1960s, efforts to remove them were defended because they were seen as obstacles to progress. The contestation of the value of this inheritance was the fruit of a narrow and sectarian nationalism that emerged as the revolutionary period faded in the struggle for economic survival. The aspiration for unity between the two political entities became little more than a slogan, until conflict re-erupted in Northern Ireland in the late 1960s. Healing divisions has been an objective ever since, to a large degree overwriting the unification narrative, with officially sponsored projects and many community-based initiatives. But there is more to this picture. The sectarian contestation had deep roots. During the years of conquest from the 16th century onwards, the great religious monasteries were suppressed. The English crown had embraced Protestantism, while the Irish remained Catholic. Lands and property were confiscated, and many churches were converted to serve the new religion. Over the centuries of conflict, these places were contested. As one side or the other gained the ascendancy, the buildings were repossessed, only to be lost again as fortunes changed. Their possession underpinned competing claims to legitimacy. That cycle of dispossession and repossession was stemmed only with the introduction in the 19th century of the idea of national monument, an idea that rose in the first instance as a practical response to challenging economic circumstances. A condition of being designated as such was that the building could not be used for worship. In this regard, heritage values appear to overcome confessional ones, but for very secular reasons. In 1998, a monument to the fallen Irish soldiers from across the religious and political affiliations serving in the British Army in World War I was opened by the Irish President in a ceremony that included the Queen of England. The project was sponsored by both administrations on the island. It was seen as supporting moves towards reconciliation between communities on the island and between Ireland and the United Kingdom, and so it did. But the monument deserves a closer look. In itself, it portrays a kind of residual cultural ambivalence. Not only was the round tower an example of architectural pastiche, borrowing its form from ecclesiastical building type from the 10th to 12th centuries, but the stone used to build it was sourced from two partly demolished historic buildings with divergent significance: a former British Army barracks and a former workhouse. Workhouses were built mostly in the 19th century to house the poorest of the poor. They often housed entire families. One of the conditions for entry was the surrender of any land owned by the applicants. Commentary on the paradoxes was muted. More recently, others have surfaced in more tangible ways. It is enough to cite two examples. In the first, 4 buildings in this modest street in Dublin, Moore Street, were declared in 2007 to be national monuments. They were the last headquarters of the rebels in 1916. The street is close to the General Post Office we saw previously. They fit the description of unintentional monument. There has been ongoing controversy concerning their future because they are part of a large commercial redevelopment project. A vocal protest group, including descendants of the rebel combatants, has taken legal action to progress their vision of the site, as they see it, an integral part of an historic battlefield site. That situation is still to be finally resolved. The second example concerns the ceremonies marking the centenary of the 1916 rebellion. Those ceremonies included the construction of a memorial wall bearing the names of all those who died in the conflict. It was intended to be an inclusive memorial, in that it carried the names of combatants on both sides and of civilian casualties as well. The Decade of Centenaries project had prompted research into the community impact of the fighting and identified the many children who were killed. Their names were also included on the monument, and yet the monument was contested. It was seen by some as giving equal standing to Irish patriots and to British soldiers. It was attacked by dissident persons 3 times, with the result that the monumental wall has been abandoned. In this case, inclusiveness does not guarantee consensus. Such experiences of monumental creation display dimensions that lie beyond the definition of regal. These kinds of disjunction and dissidence are persistent elements in actions taken to commemorate significant events, and perhaps become more visible when the commemoration focuses on monuments, including built heritage, that are presented as embodying a particular set of values, a particular reading of the past, which is then set against the present and the future as it is being shaped. In the second section, Interpretations and Forecasts, I want to speak briefly about memorialization and hidden history, on the question of sites of recent conflict on the World Heritage List, some reflections on memory, and then another story, some complexities within shared values. The historian Tony Judd, in the epilogue to his monumental book, Post-War, written about the aftermath of World War II in Europe, observes that for many years, the predominant way the European countries tackled memories of the war experiences was through memorialization. He points out that the monuments erected were often to such concepts as resistance to fascism, or to honor some category of those who had suffered, or were deported, etc. While all the time, the complicity of many citizens and administrators within those countries in the dreadful events remained unstated and unacknowledged. While the picture varied somewhat across the continent, for some places, almost 50 years passed before this reality could be dealt with openly, and the experiences of survivors could be heard and accepted. In many ways, it is still an ongoing project. Lifting our eyes from such circumstances, we can see in the contemporary international context the desire to use heritage as the fulcrum of reconciliation, of healing, and in the conservation and reconstruction of damaged historic environments, the creation of the conditions for peace into the future. For some time, there has been active debate concerning the inscription of sites of recent conflict on the World Heritage List. In 2018, at its meeting in Manama, the World Heritage Committee undertook to engage in a process of reflection and to convene an expert meeting to examine the question. A study of the philosophical dimensions of the issue was commissioned, and the Nicomas document established some elements of a framework for discussion. The World Heritage Centre drew up recommendations which it has submitted to the World Heritage Committee, the body that has responsibility for assessing, approving, or rejecting nominations from countries to have sites included. The recommendations are contained in the document Guiding Principles on the Preparation of Nominations Concerning Sites of Memory, associated with recent conflicts. Some paragraphs in the guiding principles, I quote, recognizing that the inscription of sites of memory associated with recent conflicts should serve the peace-building mission of UNESCO, and emphasizing the importance of an agreement through dialogue among the concerned states parties upon all nominations in this regard. And elsewhere, these sites, accessible or made accessible to the public, represent a place of reconciliation, remembrance, peaceful reflection, and must play an educational role in order to promote a culture of peace and dialogue. The recommendations emphasize the need for documentation that establishes authenticity, the requirement for engagement with all potentially affected stakeholders. They require an articulated interpretation strategy and education and information programs. Various states have already signaled their intentions to nominate sites for inscription. Leaving aside the complexities such as the questions of establishing outstanding universal value, it is worth looking more closely at ideas of memory and commemoration. Let us pause for a moment. We speak almost interchangeably about memory and memorialization, but we need to be conscious of what memory means. The larger human project of coming to terms with the past has brought the attention of psychologists and philosophers to the question at personal and social levels. The consensus is that it is not just a matter of recalling events from the past, as though we were retrieving data from some mental data bank. They point out that memory involves establishing relationships between events, thus forming narratives. Placing events in context means that they are understood within frames of reference, personal and social. Benson calls it a form of reconstruction through traces, in which the imagination plays an essential role. Elsewhere, he remarks that while preserving traces is an action which is necessarily retrospective, the purpose is prospective, directed towards ideals of humanity in the future. The key question is the commonality of value, the degree to which the complex inheritance from the past are part of common knowledge, as well as being embraced by scholarship or embedded in public policy. Some weeks ago, in the community hall of the village where I live, 2 films were shown, produced by an independent filmmaker. The films were one of the many creative, scholarly and community-based initiatives supported through the Decade of Centenaries project. The films were documentary reconstructions, one about Gilbert Potter, an inspector in the Royal Irish Constabulary, who was the victim of a reprisal shooting during the Wars of Independence. The other was about the final days of Liam Lynch, the commander of the rebel forces in the Civil War, and whose death ensured the end of that conflict. Shown together, the 2 films spelt out the complex web of relationships, the ambiguities, and the doubts that lay beneath events of those bitter years as they unfolded, the atrocities committed on both sides, and the quieter persistence of compassion. The filmmaker was inspired by the landscape, familiar to the audience, and the setting common to both events, and the films featured some local people in the reenactment of how things happened, and yet. Within the community are those who could not bring themselves to attend, for whom the subject matter was not just historical, but part of the tapestry of meaning that informed their lives, impacting on relationships with the living and the dead. The lessons I would draw have wider relevance. I will speak of just two. First, they show the importance of the surviving environments as anchors, both for the understanding of history. By their very existence, they are reminders of the lives of ancestors and of things that were important to them, and also as a context for constructing relationships and environments into the future. As we find them, these environments demonstrate what has mattered to people through history. They are documents to be read and understood. What we do with those inheritances today, with their superimposed layers of material and meaning, demonstrates what is important to us today and carries a responsibility towards the future. The approach we take to maintenance, repair, restoration, or reconstruction itself provides evidence of what we value. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the experiences bear witness to the complex narratives that survive the passage of time and demonstrate how persistent are the stories associated with the places we now inhabit, some of which remain to be told. I conclude by saying that the underlying project is no less than the construction of the future of our inhabitation of places. We are becoming familiar with the dimensions of the demand for sustainability and the call to build back better in the reconstruction of damaged heritage, establishing an ecological perspective in intervention and creation. But our experience is showing us also that ecology includes the human mind, first and foremost. The French philosopher Chris Younes puts the project well. We aim for an ecology of care and precaution, she says, a state between recollection and recommencement, a delicate balance of retention and renewal, with openness as the prerequisite for continuing in life. We know that the complexity of natural systems enables them to adapt and survive. Human systems need to learn from that. The responsibility of those of us who have the luxury of thinking about these things is to reflect on decisions to reconstruct, to understand and illuminate the purposes behind actions, to ensure that they support the primary importance of cultural inheritance, underpinning identities, establishing the basis for a better, more truthful, just, and therefore sustainable future. We know now that this means that it is not just what we do in conservation and reconstruction that is important, but also how we do it, how we ensure that thought and action support a condition where hope and history rhyme. The ends we hope to achieve must be within the means we use to pursue them. The decade of centenaries has one further lesson. It speaks to the passage of time, yes, but more importantly, it speaks to the unfinishable nature of the human project, a fusion of understanding and action predicated on the essential diversity that underpins any aspiration for unity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kealy. When I decided more than 20 years ago to withdraw from operative politics, I thought in this time that comparative research of Bosnia and Catalonia, Bosnia and Ireland could contribute to understanding of our key Bosnian problems. Now I'm sure that the problems of Bosnia could be found anywhere in the world. No country, no part of the globe in which we are faced with essentially the same questions in its different formal appearances. Thank you for this lecture, thank you so much, thank you again. Now, Professor Hadžimuhamedović will start our lecture. Please, Professor Hadžimuhamedović.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Mahmutćehajić, dear colleagues. I feel very honored and somehow humbled with this opportunity that has been given to me, invitation to be in line with all those speakers who all 18 years were speaking at the beginning of the conference, giving these inaugural lectures. It is my special honor to speak today after a friend of mine and colleague that I have been working for several years for ICUPE on some doctrinal documents, Professor Loughlin Kealy. That is a source of knowledge and also a source of wisdom. And thank you very much, Professor Kealy, for this wonderful lecture. I will try now to deal with this technology. I will speak about religious heritage and the politics of memory in Bosnia. Bosnia has now become a locus classicus for post-colonial conflict studies. Restoring destroyed heritage places has been described as a means of rebuilding inter-ethnic and inter-religious trust. However, the relation of post-war politics to heritage is more complicated and reflects the slow extinguishing of the smoldering embers of war. The heritage-based recovery of destroyed cities and cultural landscapes has been confronted with two challenges of their further aggressive reconfiguring. Both of them harness religious places as their agents. The first is a form of cultural cleansing through reformation of architectural styles. This reformation is expressed through alleged reconstruction of the ancient imagined forms of sacred places, often churches, often Christian Orthodox churches, which may have never existed, as well as through building churches or mosques over sacred cultural landscapes and changing common folk religious traditions associated with them. The second is through the imposition of new architectural styles of mosques and churches, the eclecticism of which is informed by current trends in the declared centers of a religious tradition, often by borrowing forms or decorative elements from the religious heritage in the same centers. These new buildings are often erected to express the domination of one religion in cultural landscape and to enhance politically driven discrimination between each other. The processes of political and societal instrumentalization of interreligious relations and coexistence in recent Bosnian history offer examples of the challenges, potentials, and risks that heritage practices may play in plural societies. I propose three receptions of Bosnia's religious heritage in relation to the question of identity. The first utilizes religious heritage as complex, intertwined identity that forms a foundation for peace building and social healing of conflict-induced traumas. The second frames heritage as an unsustainable expression of mutually exclusive identities. And the third denies Bosnian religious heritage and conceals its remains through the construction of three rival and competing identities. While the first manifests itself through holistic approach to recovery of people, natural and cultural heritage, aimed at keeping the thread of continuity and inclusiveness, the second acts through its destruction, discontinuity, and religious purification. And the third becomes apparent in the rearticulation of religious architecture, the aggressive forms of new structures without regard for their cultural and natural contexts, as well as the religious, gender-based, and even intra-religious sectarian exclusivism and discrimination. The entwined identities, places, and practices that together made the internally plural Bosnian heritage became a target in 1996 war against Bosnia, during which Croat and Serb nationalist forces sought to implement their vision of mutually exclusive cultural spheres. Bosnian Muslim heritage did not fit into any of the two visions. This war was one of the best studied cases of European conflict studies, yet the role of religion was omitted from many early works. A possible explanation is that the war took place in a time period in which Islam entered the public imagination as the rising threat to European Christian identity foundations, as declared by many far-right political groups, and even as part of the official policies of some European governments. The destruction of religious symbols and sacred buildings, and the celebration of violence and atrocities through religious rituals by both Serb and Croat forces in the first 2 years of the war speak to the centrality of religious cleansing, which certainly amounts to genocide. Religious mythologies, clergy, and rituals were harnessed to frame and legitimize ethnic cleansing during the war as a sacred act of fighting the other whose evil rested in religious difference. The exclusivist ideologies, insisting that the identities were in conflict, manifested themselves through cleaving the Bosnian society into simple component parts, xenophobic religious communities, each negating the others. The clash of identities was expressed in the destruction of heritage, and especially in the methodical destruction of the Bosnian mosques. While new lavishly decorated monumental churches were being constructed in Banja Luka and elsewhere, not a single minaret was left intact at the territories occupied by Serb armed forces since 1992. In August 1992, a Serb high police officer and the regional warlord declared, "With our mosques, you must not just break the minarets. You've got to shake the foundations, because that means they cannot build another. Do that and they want to go." The destroyed religious heritage was to be replaced by a newly constructed and distinctive Roman Catholic, Croat, or Eastern Orthodox, Serb, identity in Bosnia. In the scattered pieces of jigsaw, Muslims were faced with the startling option of choosing an exclusivist Bosniak identity, as different as possible from the Bosnian Serb or Bosnian Croat identities. Consequently, the inspiration for the new religious architecture was not derived from Bosnian heritage. It was created by the accumulation of elements from diverse foreign models. There are many examples of this, which I select just three by way of illustration. The first is the construction of historicistic Orthodox churches based on the model of Serb, Byzantine or Moravian types, replicas of the churches from Kosovo, and in a number of cases on a Russian model. Second, the erection of gigantic triumphalist Catholic buildings, deprived of their link with heritage forms, and encroaching on public spaces with the installation of crosses and shrines. And the third, the erection of the traditionalized mosques based on Arab, Turkish, or other non-Bosnian historicistic shapes. Many of these forms reflect influences of proselytists and political agendas of the transnational actors. It doesn't work. Okay, it works now. The phenomenon highlights the promotion of the fundamentalistic exclusivity by powerful transnational actors, whose influence is manifest in recent architecture. The Russian state utilized the Russian Orthodox Church to pursue its geopolitical interests in Bosnia. And now I will just illustrate several of hundreds of what happened to this.
Just sorry, we have Zoom meeting.
You should mute him.
Several examples through the photos of these spots where this implanting of the Russian influence through the church building is made. And then I will continue with the examples that are highlighting the other phenomena. So a number of churches have not only been designed in a Russian style, but were also fully financed. And here you can see in Cyrillic letter written Serbian-Russian Center of the Brotherhood of the Christian Orthodox Peoples.
Where
It is in Doboj. This one is in Doboj. But you know, you can find the whole Republika Srpska is in fact now, they are seeding, and I will show now some other examples. Like this one, that is in fact the center, huge center in construction in Banja Luka, Serbia Russian Orthodox Center, which will look like this in the very center of Banja Luka. Nothing to do, of course, with Bosnian style. Or this one in Bijeljina. There is a whole story about this monastery of St. Petka in Bijeljina, and so many other cases. Protestant, evangelical, and Roman Catholic groups from different parts of the world have competed in their activities in the country. A particularly strong influence of the Opus Dei during the post-war period in the south of Bosnia, which had been controlled and devastated during the war by the Croatian military forces, was expressed through installing a number of so-called Ways of the Cross, a succession of gigantic crosses along dominant public paths in public spaces. They were always aligned with war, installed in victorious ways at the places where the massive crimes were committed, similar to the Orthodox churches, these Orthodox churches. And in some cases, at the protected archaeological sites, thus claiming dominance over both space and time, past and present. This is in Stolac, in a medieval fortress. On 27th October 2003, the American sociologist of religion, Michael Sells, sent an open letter to Pope John Paul II, drawing his attention to the violence being perpetrated by the Church under the supervision of Bishop Perić, that was the bishop in these dioceses, and documenting his assertion with images and reports of the numerous new crosses crucifixes, shrines to the Blessed Virgin, bell towers, Croatian flags, and the crowd checkboard on the ruins of destroyed monuments and over public buildings to indicate the Catholic-only character of the cities and the state institutions. On the other hand, several Middle Eastern countries have supported mosque building designed to encourage the spread of Salafism and Wahhabism, which at the early post-war period resulted in the removal of decorative elements from surviving mosques and an anti-heritage zeal for purified Islam in Bosnia. Although dressed in humanitarian activities, those intentions to reconfigure Bosnian identity were recognized and stopped early by the Organization of Islamic Community. Here you can see one of those buildings that express this phenomenon in Bogor. They were, however, substituted by intensified Turkish political affinities, which were mostly expressed through not only financing, but also controlling and harnessing reconstruction and construction of mosques for their own geopolitical agendas. Construction of separate places for women in mosques was a new phenomenon unknown to Bosnian architectural heritage. Such places are regularly small and of secondary quality, not easily accessible, and sometimes even without windows and natural ventilation. Their invention, construction, position, and design may be understood as yet another type of exclusivism, an attempt of instrumentalizing religion for the kind of toxic masculinity that was expressed in wartime gender-based violence. The production of these new hierarchical relations was meant to suggest a tradition altogether different from the one exemplified by all mosques which had been targeted for destruction. The size and formal expression of the new churches and mosques in Bosnia derived from their role in the contemporary social environment. They express the power of each religious community over its others and are designed to project the authenticity of its distinct and alleged fundamentally pure original ethno-religious identity. Vernacular, inclusive, interreligious tradition has been submitted to authorized, religiously or politically exclusive rituals, often dominated by either Russian or Spanish or Turkish or some other customs and dress codes. What is the significance of Bosnian sacred heritage in the process of understanding religion and religious plurality in contemporary societies globally can be a question. What are the alternatives to the post-war cacophony of religious architectural forms, which depict social discord, cultural oblivion, injustice, and disrespect for nature? How the universal language of symbolism from religious heritage can inform the new post-war religious architecture to act as an agent of inclusive, religiously plural, sustainable, and resilient society. Mosques and churches have the most significant formative role, not only in the structure of Bosnian cultural landscapes, but also in the structure of individual mental maps. That paradigm is undoubtedly universally applicable. Religious cultural heritage, churches, mosques, and synagogues, with their position, minarets, towers, domes and roofs, rituals, bells, call to prayer, and the sound of the horn, determine the symbolic and spatial foci of cities and settlements, regardless of religious conviction or the lack of it. When such sacred heritage is destroyed, spatial, temporal, and wider social relations are damaged. The collective memory and individual memory scales are shattered. The emptiness and absence caused by the interruption of their duration can be alleviated by participatory, inclusive recovery and reconstruction based on the needs and traditional knowledge of the people. The reconstruction of the building fills the void. The recovery of intangible components and expressions of heritage and the participatory process ensure its represence. The represence of the people establishes the broken threads of continuity and interpersonal relations through that process. What is needed so that instead of looking for threats and constructing a politics of fear, instead of justifying demolition and killing as a holy struggle between good and evil, the legacy of the still persistent other to Europeans' prevailing self-perception comes to be recognized as an opportunity to deepen the knowledge of one's own values. The intertexture of all the components of Bosnian identity still exists. Together with the palimpsest character of the Bosnian cultural landscapes, in which the forcibly sketched out layers emerge under the recent additions of the newly constructed purified identities. But the force of destruction and the multitude of the spreading forms of exclusiveness are also undeniable. The connecting forms to Bosnian religious heritage are still at disposal as reminders of a possibility of reconciliation. Some actions of establishing cross-confessional heritage communities through participative reconstruction of destroyed heritage places have turned into means of healing the social trauma. The strategy to harness the memory of intertwined identity in peace building through rebuilding of religious heritage is an alternative to the bewildering architecture of new post-war churches and mosques, which are often emptied of any sacredness and serve the conquest of the cultural landscapes as symbols of triumphalism and oblivion of the Abrahamic commandment, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Thank you very much.
Thank you.